Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Managing the Chaos of a Cyber Incident with our sponsor, Integrion, as part of the LTRC Industry Insight Series held every Wednesday. Our speaker today is Joshua J. Franks. Josh Franks joined Integrion in January 2020 as Manager of Litigation Services and now serves as a Senior Manager within Litigation Services. As a leader who touches every aspect of the cyber incidents response workflow, Josh has specific experience identifying and communicating issues within the industry from ingestion, project workflow, final delivery, and client management. Josh is relied upon within the workflow to aid counsel in explaining the complexity of their data and manage client expectations around delivery. Further, he aids in handling complex data that requires extensive manipulation to meet the client's specific needs. Lastly, Josh has also developed and now leads the data mining offering at Integrion, which aids in reducing costs and the scope of manual reviews. Before joining Integrion, Josh spent time within the cyber incident response space and the sales tax software arena. This experience helps Josh blend cyber incidents issues with the knowledge of overall data workflow. Thank you all for joining us. We'll now begin the webinar.
Thank you, Sasha. As Sasha stated, my name is Josh Franks. I'm a Senior Manager here at Integrion. The following presentation is not going to be around legal advice, but are actually going to be about the variables and trends that you need to be aware of when deciding how to handle cyber incident responses. These variables should be looked at usually by counsel and the end client to determine the risk and reward with each unique situation. As a review company, Integrion, we face these issues daily, and we always raise these issues to clients concerning their projects and their data. We do not decide on which path they actually take. That is something that they have to decide for themselves. Also, apologies, the slideshow tends to be a little slow based off going through Zoom. Okay, so what we'll be covering today is what is a cyber incident, who does what and when. This will be a flow chart to show you the main stages within the actual workflow of cyber incident. I threw in the typical workflow within a review company because that is something that I'm going to continuously reference. So it's nice to see how it starts, how it actually occurs from beginning to end. The next one is going to be differences between cyber incident response and eDiscovery litigation matters. This is going to be the main one that I actually discuss. And this is usually the one that really impacts how workflows occur because most counsel is used to an actual eDiscovery and litigation matters, and cyber incident response is just so different than that arena. Next is going to be pitfalls to look out for. And then at the end, it's going to be tips and tricks to manage the chaos. Okay, I'm going to throw some definitions up on the screen that you can read for yourself. I'm just going to talk over the top of this. So we just had a recent cyber attack that I'm sure most people are aware of, and that is, slideshow went a little too quickly. That most people are aware of, and that is the pipeline incident. That is more of an actual hardware incident. So what I'm going to be talking about is more around the lines of data. So that is that occurs around ransomware. It also comes around to email compromises or business email compromises. Not every incident that occurs is a malicious incident either. So just an accidental disclosure can also make a cyber incident occur. Okay. So we got some general definitions there. So this is the main phases and players that are involved when it comes to cyber incidents. Okay, so what you can see here in this flow chart is the cyber attack occurs. I'm going to constantly refer to this as the end client. So whose data was actually breached. with Integron and our review company's workflow, we always reference that person as the end client. Like I was saying earlier, this could be a ransomware attack, a phishing attack, email compromise, file servers. There's numerous ways that this can actually occur. Next is that the threat is found and acknowledged. So the bad actor has done something and it actually gets caught by the actual end client. Sometimes that may take a while because if the attack was for example, an email forwarding rule. So what happens is that a bad actor gets access to an email account. They set up a rule that automatically forwards emails that have been sent to and from the account, and then I'll also put in a rule in place that automatically deletes that email was forwarded. So sometimes it's not an instantaneous acknowledgement of the actual threat. Next, usually during that time as well, the end client will usually, once it's actually found, the end client will usually obtain outside counsel and forensics to assist in the response. However, that is typical. Sometimes, however, end clients actually perform all these tasks internally. Well, they'll use their own IT department and they'll use their own in-house counsel. However, if they do go to a forensics team, I believe, in my opinion, this is where the real work starts to occur. And that's because the forensics team actually has to conduct the investigation of what was actually breached. So when it comes to that kind of issue, if it's a file server compromise, they have to actually go in there and say, okay, you may have 2 terabytes of file server that you're working with, but what was actually compromised by the bad actor? And maybe it's only 100 gigs or 250 gigabytes. So that's really where the main work occurs when it comes to trying to get their arms around it. So once the forensic team identifies this subset, sometimes they'll do just an initial removal of junk files, like you can imagine application files, before they actually deliver it to an outside vendor. And the reason they do this initial culling is that it really helps reduce the cost of moving that much data and processing that much data. And then once they actually determine the scope of the review and what data actually needs to be looked at, that's when it's actually handed off to a cyber incident response company, for example, Integron. So the main players on the side would be counsel, either in-house counsel or outside counsel. I'm going to skip insurance company. Victim, which I'm constantly going to refer to as the end client. The review company, which is what Integron really focuses in on. We have a forensics team, and then we have the notification service. So notification service is a very contrasting difference when it comes to cyber incident response versus litigation, is that letters actually have to go out to these victims of their actual end data, and that they have to actually be notified of what was actually compromised. Was it their social? Was it their bank account? So those letters have to be delivered, and people have to put on notice of what was actually breached. Insurance company is a main player that we have to deal with when it comes to on the review side. And that is because the insurance company is usually the one that is actually paying the bill. Most major companies, and even some of the smaller companies, have insurance coverage for these type of attacks. So you can imagine that the person paying the bill is going to have a major impact on what is actually covered. And so the communication with them is always vital when issues come up, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, so the typical workflow when it comes to a cyber incident response company is going to be on the next slide. So this is the typical workflow that occurs. So the incident occurs, which was already on the chart. Forensics performs their investigation. They actually collect that data, and then they actually send it to the review company. So when that happens, they actually send us the raw data. We ingest that data and we put it into a review platform. Data mining occurs. That is another very key distinction that I'm going to get into in a little bit. Data mining when it comes to cyber incident response is very different than it comes to eDiscovery. With data mining, you actually have to do more than just do a search term overlay, which I'll get into in a second. The review is the actual extraction of that data from within each file. So you can imagine emails and PDFs, Excel. So the data that's actually contained within those have to be extracted out and then put into a workable deliverable. And then QC is happening throughout the process. then the delivery actually occurs. So the delivery is what actually drives all these phases, because the deliverable is what really what makes a major impact on budget and actually getting notifications out, because with that delivery is what the actual end client is actually paying for. Is that usually it's an Excel worksheet. Okay, so I wanted to just cover that quickly. So this is the big one. This is something that I'm not sure all the players that are in this webinar are going to see this webinar, but this is something that if we could take anything away from managing the chaos of cyber incident response, it would be this slide right here. So the first thing is, when it comes to cyber incidents, you're doing an informative or a reporting versus adversarial. So once again, the actual end product is what's really driving cyber incident response. Is that end deliverable to notify people is what really is what's really getting paid for. In eDiscovery and litigation matters, it's adversarial. You know what the end person is looking for. You know what the matter is about. Next up would be the main issue, which drives some of the chaos within cyber incident, is that extraction. So when you're doing extraction in cyber incident response, it's very different than eDiscovery, because with eDiscovery, you have a known data set and you have a known issue. So you're really just flagging those files and getting it packaged to send to the other party. When it comes to cyber incident, you're not only have to identify those documents and actually get those into isolated to the side so review can happens, you actually have to extract the data. And that is where the actual timeframes are really jump into play here, is because if you have, it's very different than flagging a document like a PDF saying this document has PII versus actually extracting the data out of that PII, out of that document, because the document could be 500 pages long. It could be scans, it could be patient data. So flagging it and then but versus extracting all that data out is very different. CRR deliverable versus the production and a priv log. So this really also impacts the time frame. So a CRR deliverable typically is a large spreadsheet with names, addresses, and what was actually compromised. So you can imagine that during the extraction phase, there is a lot of data actually being pulled out and recorded. All of this data has to be consolidated down and actually given to the end client at the conclusion of the review. And that's because this end deliverable is being used to actually send the letters out, the notifications letters out. So the major issue is having bad addresses or bad names or just overall bad data. When it comes to production and priv log, you're really looking at a broad scope. You're looking at a narrow scope and a narrow set of tags for a narrow set of issues. Like I was saying, the example is that when it comes to litigation, the data set is known. You know why everyone has come together, but when it's CIR, it's very broad. So when production happens, it's just packaging those native files together and actually delivering it out to the opposing party. Timeframes, if you can see here, I put timeframes for each one when it comes to cyber incident response and eDiscovery. Timeframes for cyber incident, once again, it's that kind of GoGo mentality, which you'll hear me reference a lot when it comes to the later slides. In that the time frame for trying to get all of the above done when cyber incident response, the extracting, the isolating, the delivery, it's a misconception that the same amount of data when it comes to eDiscovery can be delivered in the same amount of time for a cyber incident, which is very different, because when it comes to eDiscovery and litigation matters, typically you are only delivering the native files, you are only isolating the native files. You're not really working on a spreadsheet of addresses and a spreadsheet of names and trying to get everything to line up so actual notification letters can be sent out. Next up is context in CIR versus context in eDiscovery. I touched on it a little bit, but most of the time when it comes to cyber incident response versus eDiscovery, you can see in this infographic, there is a data there's a data pile here. And this is very, like I said, this is one of my favorite infographics when it comes to cyber incident response. And that is because when it comes to the context of CIR, you really don't know what's in this data. Most of the time, people are using search terms to try to look up and try to isolate these type of files and try to keep them sorted. But when it comes to eDiscovery or litigation, you know the context of the file. So a good example would be if you are doing a contract dispute and the contract has only occurred in the past 6 months, there's no reason for the opposing party or for you to deliver to the opposing party all the contract issues that the company has ever faced in the past 5 years. So you kind of are able to narrow down your scope of review and data just based off knowing what the actual context of the litigation matter is. When it comes to cyber incident response, most of the time people are really do not know what their data contains. And they're really trying to use us as a review company and sometimes even forensics teams to try to understand what's actually in the data. They may have broad ideas of what could be in the data, but then they kind of use us as a review company to help them sort that out. The major differences that comes with working with Integrion is that when we perform data mining, that is something that we help with our clients to actually reduce the cost. So when that comes into play, we actually work with them to try to understand their data more instead of, once again, being like eDiscovery and just running down generic terms like account number or social security number. We really try to get unique terms for each project. Another thing is that when you're trying to narrow the scope of all this data, once again, keywords is always comes into play. So when you get the data into a review platform, the most common request is that key terms are ran on the data for cyber incident response. And that is very similar to something that is done in litigation. But just because in cyber incident response, just because, for example, social security number hits does not mean it's going to be relevant. You actually have to look at the context of the document. So for example, we've had in the past where we've had data sets with large hits of social security numbers. And if you were to just look at the hit count itself, you would not realize that there are a bunch of false hits, even though it looks relevant. And that's because when you look into the actual document and the documents of the hits, they're actually just blank forms that contain the word social security number in. That's always sent out to every single new hire or new employee. So that is something that you have to look out for when it comes to cyber incident response versus eDiscovery. Is it's more than just a keyword such as social. You actually have to look down into the data itself to see what is actually happening. This obviously gets even more complicated when HIPAA or GDPR, PIPEDA comes into play because there is broad protections there. So you can imagine that trying to sort data that has all these broad protections and using broad key terms, it really makes it difficult to try to get this sorted. That's why it's always important when it comes to cyber incident is to understand your data and understand the underlying context of that data. The next one is scope and knowledge. So when it comes to knowledge, once again, when you're in a litigation matter, everyone kind of knows why we're there. Once again, the contracts issue, contracts dispute, everyone knows there's a contract in play. They know the title, they know the custodians, they know who was sending emails back and forth. So you're able to actually narrow down that review set or this data set by that knowledge. That's very different when it comes to cyber incident response, is that the scope of the data is usually not known by the end client. I just spoke about this earlier today, and the problem is that so much data is being collected, even by smaller companies, that it's really hard to kind of keep in line what all the data that you have and in which folder that it contains. So you're going to get the scope is just so unknown. And once again, most end clients and most counsel rely on forensics teams or they actually rely on the review company itself to try to help them determine the scope. So once again, when it comes to this infographic, this is kind of really just lays out these issues in a visual representation. So we get the data, we have to sort it, and that usually occurs after processing within a review platform. Getting data arranged usually means relevant data versus not relevant data. Try to get jurisdictions grouped together, and that occurs after data mining. And then presented visually is getting all this data and getting all the extracted out into the actual end deliverable. Okay. And unfortunately, since I am sharing, I cannot see the chats right away. So we will look at the chats at the end of the slideshow. Okay. So what are the pitfalls of cyber incident response? And I'm using this as the header because failure to manage the client and failure to manage the client expectations is the number one pitfall when it comes to cyber incident response. And that is because usually they are dealing with so much pressure from either board members or regulators, or maybe they have an idea of eDiscovery litigation, so they have an idea of how fast review should go. So looking at managing their expectation and actually managing the client, and failure to do so is usually what causes the biggest mistakes. Okay, so data's content. I touched on this a little bit in the previous slides, but most of the time when data is breached, it can be an issue because not only is that data out, but most of the time the actual end client doesn't know the contents of that data. So we've had examples in the past where they assumed that based off this person's title that they should not have any HR data in there. There should be no actual scanned PDFs or any of those kind of issues. But once you actually looked into the data, we started seeing that there was a lot of scanned PDFs, and they were could not be converted easily, and bad text files. So the actual content itself, because most of the time what you're going to run into when you're trying to avoid these pitfalls is that they will not a 5,000 doc project in one area and a 5,000 doc project in another. It's not only different because of industry, but could be different because of the underlying file types. Maybe something is completely all email traffic, and the other may be PDFs from a file server. So actually understanding the content of the data and the file type breakdown of the data is what's vital in trying to manage the client's expectations of how fast you can actually get through it, how large the deliverable is going to be, and how big of a time frame that you need to actually deliver. So this kind of assumptions on the underlying data kind of connects to the data's content, is that not only will you have to be wary of assumptions of what's the underlying content of the file type breakdown, you have to actually be wary of the actual assumptions on the underlying data, where I just touched on it, where you will be promised by the end client that based off their folder structure and based off their company overall policy, that there should be no data within these 5 folders. We're going to give it to you, Josh, and your team to kind of look it over, but there should be no data over there. And 9 times out of 10, there is usually protected information over there. And it's usually because there's so much data they can't keep it organized correctly, or maybe they just have one employee. It only takes one employee to start filing things incorrectly within an overall file server to really mess up people's assumptions. So I would always say never assume nothing, because the data is always what drives it. Until you get your hands on the actual data, you have no idea what's going to be in there, because I have been promised multiple times that there should be no company information, or the social security number should not be in there. I know this person's job role, they should not be working in social security numbers. But once we actually get into the data, we can actually see that, oh, this person usually does not work with social security numbers, but she was actually helping out someone in HR and it was also helping out with someone in Europe. So making assumptions on the underlying data is always a recipe for disaster, or a recipe to like not manage the client's expectations, because you may get the data itself, you may have it shown to you and say, hey, we have a 5,000 doc project. Do you think we can fit it within this budget? And do you think we could fit it in this time frame? And then you're going to make assumptions to try to meet that deadline, which is usually you may get away with it a couple times, but usually the underlying data is always going to come up and actually be an issue for you to actually resolve that timeline request. This is something along the lines of processing complications usually occurs after ingestion of this data. And once again, counsel and companies are usually relying on keywords way too often and not looking at the actual context of the data. Processing complications come into play if you're relying on key terms too much and you have OCR issues, that automatically you may want to kick out those no hits. So just as a quick breakdown, once data is ingested into a review platform, the typical approach is to run key terms such as account number, financial account number, social security number, date of birth, very generic terms over the data. However, if you're just looking at the key terms and not looking at the underlying data itself, maybe there was OCR issues and because the data was all scanned PDFs. Once again, I'm going to keep going back to scanned PDFs because that is always an issue when it comes to actually getting these reviews completed. So there may be an OCR issue, but if you don't understand the actual data and the actual ingestion, that you can actually overlook those kind of issues where you can actually deliver results to counsel either after search term being ran or after delivering data mining results. And the typical answer from counsel or the typical question from counsel, why are there 5,000 documents within this set that needs to go to manual review that don't have any hits on them? We should kick those out. They don't have any hits. And usually what happens is I have to get on a phone call with them and state, yes, you're correct. They don't have any hits, but that's because they're all images of driver's license. And the OCR could not pick up any text because they're images of driver's license. So once you actually start understanding the processing complications, it's once you get on the phone with counsel, which I always highly suggest, I do not suggest email. Once you get on the phone with counsel and actually have this kind of dialogue, they'll understand, oh, I'm glad Josh looked a little bit further, because if it was just look at the terms, put the terms into the review pile versus no hits into the do not review, you're going to miss these kind of issues. The go mentality. This is something that I kind of came up with for this presentation, and now I'm going to start using it more often. That's because going back to the distinction between cyber incident response and eDiscovery, cyber incident response is just so much faster. It's really hard to quantify that. Everything is spun up faster. Everything needs to be delivered faster. That is the go mentality. And the most common answer that we get when it comes to deadlines is that there is no hard deadline. We just want it as soon as possible. That is usually 9 times out of 10 the default. Sometimes we do have a hard deadline from regulators, but most of the time we don't have a hard deadline. It's how fast can you turn this around? How many bodies can you put into this? So when you're around the go mentality, that's when you get into the trap of guaranteeing a time frame before knowing the underlying data. So what I was just talking about earlier, issues that could be pitfalls for you. Most of the times you're going to try to be put into a corner to try to deliver and meet timeframes without even knowing the underlying data itself. They may give you a document count and they may give you an industry, and that's it. And you're going to have to try to face these issues of try to go into the go mentality without actually knowing what's in the data. So the go mentality without proper communication is always going to cause major issues within the project. And that kind of, once again, goes back to managing the client. The client is facing so much pressure to deliver results, either internally or externally, that most of the time they're not thinking about the pitfalls, or if you start too fast without really flushing things out, what are the budget implications for that? So the go mentality is something that is a major issue when it comes to cyber incident response, and that is because everyone wants it faster and than the last one. Um, so, and once again, I think the best thing to do when it comes to people feeling this kind of pressure is that you always need to communicate that pressure is being applied to the end client, and maybe even counsel is getting a lot of pressure. You need to understand that you got to communicate to them that pressure is being applied, but that processes have to be in place. So you may get away with that mentality for one project, but the next project could cause serious budget issues or timeline issues because you're trying to go way too fast. Okay. Document count. This kind of also connects with the data's content and the assumptions on underlying data. And that is because majority of the time, the document count, in my opinion, tells you nothing. I know that is always relied upon when it comes to cyber incident response, is that what's the document count? How many documents are we talking about? How many gigs are we talking about? It might be helpful to know that, but once again, until you see the data, it's really hard to make assumptions based off the document count. We've had experiences at Integron, and I've had experiences outside of Integron where the data set may only be 10,000 documents, but it's going to cost $500,000 to get it done. And which is really hard because, once again, going back to the main player slide, the insurance company is going to have a very difficult time understanding that kind of correlation. They're going to really have a hard time understanding why 10,000 documents could be $500,000. And it's because we have to communicate to them, to counsel, to end client, is that it's not about the document count, it's about the data within the document count that we have to extract out. So getting that extraction into an end deliverable that's workable, that's why you really have to be wary of making assumptions about document count. Most common thing is, this is only 3,000 docs. You should be able to do 3,000 docs within a week. Or this is only 10,000 docs. You should be able to do 10,000 docs within 3 weeks. Those are the kind of conversations that you really have to hedge on. That's just the unfortunate word to say. But once you actually start talking about these pitfalls, it will start making more sense of why we can't overpromise. Because if you start overpromising because people are in that go mentality, you may win that bid, you may win that project, but a week in, you'll realize that the budget's not enough, the time frame's not enough, you don't have enough people lined up for the project. So making those kind of assumptions around document count usually cannot be relied upon until you actually see the data. Once you see the data, then you can kind of have a better conversation with them about what it's going to take. But trying to agree to 3,000 docs should take 1 week is usually going to be a recipe for disaster. And that's because not only do you have to extract that data, you have to QC it, you have to deliver it to the actual end client. Unique request. This is something that will not appear very often, obviously because it's unique, but it's that 1 out of 10 that when it does appear, it's going to really bite you, and it's really going to mess up your budget and your time frames. And that is because it will go in, and you'll be working with either a common vendor or a common counsel, and maybe you guys do the exact same kind of protocol and deliverable every single time. But without communicating a unique request, such as a good example of this was when we were communicating with a vendor or a counsel that we work with often, that they had a unique request of an employee number and that they wanted the employee number captured. Usually in a typical cyber incident response, that is not captured. That is something that is not protected based off how we work with counsel. From our interactions with counsel, most of the time counsel does not want that number captured, but they did. And having that conversation with counsel in the beginning about these unique requests allowed us to avoid a big pitfall. And that is because having the employee number captured within this particular project significantly impact the budget. I would say times 10 impacted the budget. And that is because we had to extract all the employee numbers out of this data set. It also impacted the time frame because there's more people having to manipulate the data to get this kind of unique request. So always, I would say always ask, even if you've been working with the same counsel and the same partners, always try to make sure that there's no unique request with this individual data set. Okay. And then, so misconceptions surrounding the finished product. So once again, the finished product is the end deliverable. That is what drives cyber incident response, is that spreadsheet of addresses that you're going to send notifications to. The big example that I can give, and that is something that is such an easy switch, but can make such a huge impact, is that if you have a project and you have an end deliverable template laid out, and maybe they want a medical record number as a checkbox, just as a yes value versus the actual text itself. When they approve the template for you to actually be collecting and extracting the data, they want that to still just be a checkbox. But after delivery, so the review is complete, QC is complete, and they actually start working on delivering notifications, then they'll come back and say, actually, we need this as a text field. That is a big issue because just a simple switch of a yes to the actual text itself can actually be you could actually end up doing the review all over again. And once again, talking about the main players, insurance companies, they sometimes they don't realize that those kind of issues happen, and it's impossible to really understand that issue happens until the deliverable is completed, and that that counsel is really trying to send out letters to people. However, you can try to get counsel and the end client into that mindset as a review company, and that is, okay, this is the end deliverable that you sent to us, that you wanted to, this is the template that you agreed to. However, what happens if addresses are not as prevalent as you assumed? What is the next data point that you're going to rely upon? Usually when you do that, you can actually get them to start thinking about text fields and what actual data points they're going to rely upon to actually send letters out to. It's not on this slide, but another quick one is foreign language. That is a major pitfall that I've started seeing more, is because more multinational companies are starting to be breached within this space. And you can imagine that the amount of staffing issues and dealing with 15 plus different languages, from ingestion to data mining to review, that can really be a big pitfall that sometimes people need to ask up front is, okay, we may know you're in Europe, but what countries in Europe? What languages are communicated in Europe? Those are something that you should be aware of when you're actually communicating with counsel and end client. And counsel should be aware of these kind of issues that can really drive up the cost once again. Okay. This is going to be the last slide. Once again, I apologize. I cannot, unfortunately, see the Q&A or anything on my screen while I'm sharing. So hopefully we can get to those at the end. The main one that you've probably picked up on me already saying, and this is going to be the overarching answer to all of this, is communicate, communicate, communicate. And that means that seems like common sense. Of course, people are going to communicate when it comes to complex issues, and that they are going to have conversations surrounding it. But you have to realize that communicate means in avoiding the go, go, go mentality. In a box, it makes sense. Everybody's going to communicate. But once the pressure is applied and people are trying to start really fast and they're really trying to put pedal to the metal, that's when you have to communicate if there's issues. And that's when sometimes you have to be the bad person within the conversation. And that's because you have to kind of put the brakes on to going to review or getting the actual data extracted. And that's because maybe there's a text field that we, like, once again, we just referenced. There's a text issue, or there's a data issue, or there's a processing issue, or maybe you don't realize that there are major issues. The council doesn't realize there are major issues that could really that could drive up the cost. Unfortunately, that's the time you really have to communicate. And you cannot just simply say, yes, let's go, we'll start, we'll throw 50 reviewers in this and we'll just get it done. Usually that's when those pitfalls come about and the time frame can't be met anyway. So when you're communicating, you're not only communicating that, you're also the issues is that you're also communicating the factors. So you got to manage the factors. It's not only manage the client's expectations. That really means manage the factors. So that means budget. You got to manage. You have to manage your budget. You have to manage your communication. You have to manage the deliverable, and overall, you have to manage the data. So managing those factors is what's really going to help you manage the chaos, because I can, based off my experience, I see this space ever not being chaotic. It's always going to be a chaotic space. That's just the nature of the business, unfortunately. That's because people get breached at different times, there are different time frames, there are different data requirements. It's always going to be chaotic. But as counsel or as a review company, it's my opinion that you really have to manage those factors when it comes to managing this chaos. So that kind of goes into budget complications that is something that should never be a surprise to anyone. Once again, going back to the main player, who is paying the bill? The insurance company, majority of the time, is the one that is paying this bill. And it should not be a surprise to them at the invoice stage, when the invoice goes out and they had a desired budget for the project and the invoice goes out and it's exponentially more and they had no awareness of the issue. Once again, you have to communicate with counsel and in client, and sometimes even the insurance company, because they'll come to you and say, once again, how is 10,000 documents $500,000? And once again, you have to understand the data and understand what counsel requested so you can actually answer that to them. Also, this is a funny phrasing, but is the final deliverable final? So you have to manage the client's expectations and communicate with them and manage the chaos, because sometimes you may do everything perfectly. Once again, you may have completed the review in the required time frame. You have maybe went under budget. You've done everything correct. However, once the deliverable is received by counsel, maybe 3 months later, they come to you and say, hey, we have 50,000 lines and we can't find their addresses. So once again, that's when it comes down to communication and avoiding the go mentality, is that when the deliverable, it comes back to you, once again, it goes back to communication and communicating those factors, because sometimes the answer is there's no addresses, there's no way we can help you, because we just did not agree to a fast start. We actually looked through the data before we agreed to this and said, hey, there's just nothing there for us to do. Sometimes that is the answer. And may not be the best when it comes to getting the actual addresses. Working with your partners and giving your partners the correct answer, even though it's not going to be the yes, 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 or go answer that they want, is sometimes going to be better, because then they can manage their own end clients' expectations. And lastly, rely on partners. That's how you really manage the chaos. It doesn't necessarily have to be Integrion. If you have a forensics partner that you work with, or you have a review company that you work with, or even conversely, if you have counsel that you work with, relying on them is going to be key to managing the chaos. There's so many, as you saw in the previous slides, there are so many moving parts when it comes to cyber incident response, that if one person is not relied upon, or if more is asked of one person, then the whole thing can fall apart and time frames can really be thrown off. So pick a reliable partner is key, and allowing them to perform their function, allowing them to complete their actual work. Once again, it doesn't have to be Integron. It can be another review company or another forensics team that you're working with. You have to pick partners that you can rely upon, that are going to deliver, once again, deliver the bad news, and put you in a position to succeed and actually manage the client's expectations.
That's all the time that we're going to have for today. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Integrion, and all of you for attending our webinar today. If you are curious about future webinars, you can check out the ABA LTRC page or follow our Twitter at LTRC for updates. I would also like to thank Joshua for presenting today. You can keep up with Integrion at Integrion on Twitter and integrion.com. We will now conclude the webinar. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.